Hi Izzy, hi Ellie. So we're going to be doing the book review, this time on the book In His Steps by Charles M. Sheldon. And it's pretty much of a classic. It was written in the 1900s, and so it's written at an earlier time politically as you read the book, and you know it's a time of prohibition and different things going on. And in the midst of all this, the storyline is a church where the pastor and the church stand up and decide to do to follow Jesus' steps, to do what Jesus would do. Have you ever heard the saying, "What would Jesus do?" And the bracelets we made and everything actually comes from this book, In His Steps. And so I think it would be really important. I thought each one of you could take, basically Ellie could take the women in the book and kind of write a little bit on them. And of course, Izzy could take the men in the book. And well, what the whole storyline is how Jesus affects us in our walk with God. And if we would do everything just the way Jesus would do, we would find our lives in different circumstances. And this actually would end up spreading to other people and maybe even to other communities. And that's what it did in this book. So let's start with chapter 1. The first scripture says, "For hereunto ye called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." And that's in 1 Peter 2:21. And so that is actually what the book is all about, is that we are called to God to walk in his steps. The storyline starts with Reverend Henry Maxwell, and he is of the First Church of Raymond, and the town of Raymond, and he's in a really well-to-do church, and he's getting ready for his Sunday service in chapter 1. And he has a knock at the door, and a man comes, and the man looks like a tramp. Looks like maybe a homeless person or something. Needless to say, he is homeless. And he comes and he's out of a job, and he just asks the pastor if anything he could do around the church to make some money, because he's having a really hard time now. And the pastor basically says, "I don't have anything for you to do. I'm very sorry." And he kind of closes the door and says goodbye. And then he kind of looks and says a couple nice things and says, "Well, I'm sorry, maybe if come back another time," or something. He's actually cordial to him, but he doesn't help him. And so as for the church service goes on the next day. Well, in the meantime, of course, this homeless guy, walks around trying to find work, and he runs into some of the other members of the church, and basically nobody gives him work, or nobody really cares about him. And so then that day passes, and Sunday morning you see a beautiful young lady named Rachel Winslow, and she's going to become one of the star characters in the book. And she is singing with the choir, and she has this beautiful, beautiful worship voice, and she's singing all of Jesus, and everyone is just astounded by her singing. And so in the midst of all this, the pastor stands up, starts to give them the sermon, and a sound of a man's voice comes in and interrupts. And out of the shadows comes this man, the same man that had come to the door. And he basically says, I will probably die in a few days. He had tuberculosis or something. And in a low tone, he said, basically, he's talking about, how he just needed some help, and that he was out of a job. His last job, he was a printer, and basically the lineotype took over his job. This machine took over his job, and they let him go. His wife died, and he had a daughter that he left with neighbors, and he was trying to find some work so he could go back. In the meantime, he was sickly. He was becoming sick and starving. And so he goes on and says, obedience, faith, love, imitating. What do Christians mean by following the steps of Jesus? When the pastor gave In His Steps, He would say, what does that mean to follow the steps of Jesus? You know, I've had no help, no sympathy. The minister, I went to the door with the minister. He basically said he had nothing for me either, even though he was kindly. He was probably the only one that was kind to me. But what do you mean when you sing about Jesus? What do you mean? What does being a Christian mean? And he goes on, and in the midst of all this, his voice kind of gets softer and softer, and he falls over, right over on the communion table and in the aisle. And everybody's like, oh, oh, and taking him. The minister comes and helps him and actually takes him home with him. And he's a very sick man. That's chapter 1. So we have in the midst, the whole congregation is shocked by this man's story as he's coming in, and they're very upset with themselves, or at least some of them are, and how they handled this man needing help, and how they could ignore people that really were in need. And so chapter 2 goes on with Henry Maxwell, and he took the man into his spare room, and for 3 days he's trying to help this man, and then on the 3rd day he actually turned and he died. And so Maxwell and his wife, they want to take care of his little girl, they want to help in this. They feel very remorse that they hadn't helped him before. And so the Sunday preaching came that night, the next Sunday, I should say. Henry Maxwell, the pastor, he's thinking about all of this and thinking, we as a church, we haven't been reached out. We very, very into ourselves. And he's thinking as for himself and what kind of message he should preach. And he gets on his knees and he asks the Lord and prays. And in the midst of all his prayer and everything, the Lord shows up, and he takes the same scripture in his steps. And he thought, we should make a pledge. We should make a pledge to live as Jesus would live. So in the congregation, there's a few characters that you're going to get to know. And one of them was Edward Norman, and he's the editor of a newspaper called the Daily News for 10 years. And then on to Alexander Powers, and he is he works for the railroad, he's superintendent for the railroad there. Donald Marsh is the president of a college, Lincoln College. Milton Wright is a merchant, a businessman in Raymond. Dr. West is a doctor. And then we have this young Jasper Chase, who's the author of a novel that he wrote about this girl, actually his girlfriend, who is Rachel Winslow, which is a star character in the book. And she is the singer, the worship leader. And on to Miss Virginia Page. Miss Virginia Page and her brother, they had lost their parents in an accident, and now they have inherited lots of money. And their grandmother is actually living with them, and they are basically taking over, the estate now, wondering, how they should live in the midst. So you have some star players that are in this church, a few other ones too. And so Henry Maxwell gets up and he offers a pledge to volunteers that would like to pledge what would Jesus do for an entire year. And they'd have to sign a pledge. Can you imagine that? If you were going to sign a pledge, what would Jesus do for that year? So he decided, he preaches the message and says basically how, what would Jesus have done? Everyone's thinking now in the sense of this homeless guy, what should they have done? And what would Jesus do if their lives were different? They really were living for Jesus. And so he offers this and says, if you'd like to pledge your life for 1 year, and what would Jesus do? Come, to the back room here, and we're going to have a meeting and pray. What would Jesus do? Well, the congregation is full, a few hundred people, but 50 people actually decide to come back. But some of the star players that came back are the ones that I mentioned. And so, so he said, last Sunday it left me dissatisfied with my previous definition of Christian discipleship. And now, led by truth, that we can be guided in all of the truth in our lives and be honest with ourselves. So then we go on to chapter 3. In chapter 3, he says, basically the scripture is to walk even as he walked. Who walked? As Jesus walked. And we're talking now about one of the men that signed the pledge. What would Jesus do?